Netflix has finally released a new limited series Western, so let's talk about it. This video won't have any specific spoilers about the characters, the plot, or the general arc of the series, but more the good, the bad, and what you can expect from American Primeval now on Netflix. Anyone who knows me knows that I am a huge fan of Westerns, and in 2017, when Netflix released Godless, I was so excited. Godless is a fantastic introduction to the Western genre for new viewers of Westerns. It's brilliant storytelling, beautifully shot, wonderful casting, the music is spot on, and I was so excited because I thought Netflix is going to be ushering in a new era of Westerns. And of course, we have seen a little bit of a resurgence of the Western, specifically with the success of Kevin Costner's Yellowstone. Yellowstone in particular has done really well at engaging modern audiences because of its modern setting, and I think that its precursor, 1883 and 1923, are doing a great job of drawing people back into the more traditional Western. With a few film exceptions in the 90s, mostly helmed by the greats like Clint Eastwood and Kevin Costner, we really haven't seen a major comeback of the Western, despite many efforts to bring them back into the mainstream media. So will American Primeval bring us back to the glory days of Western film and TV? Let's start with the good. Starting with the obvious, American Primeval is brilliantly shot. It is very beautiful to watch. The cinematography is excellent. On that note, I really love it when a Western shows you the dirty, gritty, real life aspects of living in the American West, and American Primeval absolutely does this. This is not your fancy, fresh, new duds Western. This is real life people who have lived in the world that they are in. So huge props to the costume designers in this series because it really feels like the time period. And this is a very interesting time period to talk about that we don't actually see very often in Westerns. And so I think they really nailed it spot on with how it looks with regards to photography, cinematography, clothing. It looks really nice. There is a lot of discourse about period pieces and the actors having what they call iPhone face or looking too modern for the period that they are being depicted in. I can assure you that does not happen in this series. The actors that they chose for the series, they really fit the look of this time period, and they just feel like they could have been taken right out of the moment. Honestly, with a few exceptions, if I hadn't actually read who the cast was, I wouldn't have recognized almost anybody that was in this. And that is a good thing. With regards to the story itself, American Primeval takes place in 1857. This is a very interesting time in American history. It is pre-Civil War. And this story in particular focuses on that clash between religion and culture in the Utah Territory. Fans of the AMC series Hell on Wheels that came out in 2011 will recognize some thematic elements of the storytelling and some plot points that were referenced in this series. This series, however, was post-Civil War, so it takes place about 10 years after what we see happening in American Primeval, but there are some moments in both that harken back to the same struggle that is happening specifically in the Utah Territory. Unlike Hell on Wheels and unlike Godless, and to an extent unlike Yellowstone, American Primeval is a very graphic and violent, very brutal look at the American West. This series does not pull its punches on violence. I was actually incredibly surprised to see how violent it was. It's not something I've ever seen from Netflix. This is another level of graphic storytelling. But it does offer a relatively realistic perspective of what it was like trying to survive in this part of the country from both the settler perspective and the perspective of the indigenous population. And yes, in American Primeval, we do get some varied perspectives of what is going on in the story. These perspectives include the settlers, the Mormons, the American military, and the indigenous Shoshone tribe. But there are only 6 episodes, so you can only pack so much in here, which leads me to the one thing about the series that I really didn't like. There is a lot going on in this show, and one of the areas where I think it struggles is with its focus. When you start watching this show, there really isn't a clear protagonist. There is a character that starts to get more screen time over everybody else, and by the time you reach the end of the series, you realize, oh, that is the protagonist. Unfortunately, that character spends the first 3 episodes being incredibly insufferable, and I find myself really struggling to connect with them on an emotional level as a viewer. The characters I found myself personally connecting with had much smaller roles in the overall story. which was a little disappointing because I was like, that's where my empathy was. That's where I was like, oh, I really want to know what happens to her. I really want to know what happens to him. But the focus kept drawing back to this other character who was the lead, but maybe wasn't the most successful lead. Which is not to say that that character isn't great and doesn't have a fantastic arc. They absolutely do. The problem comes with the shift in focus between the multiple stories that they are trying to tell over the course of these 6 episodes. If you're familiar with the kind of large world-building storytelling of something like Game of Thrones or Foundation, that is what they are trying to do here, but in a smaller, more isolated area. Unfortunately, it kind of falls into the same quandary that Dune Prophecy falls into, where there is a lot going on, we're doing a lot of head hopping between one character to another, and we never get fully invested in one particular character until very close to the end of the story. And seeing how this was meant to be a limited series with a very small run, I think it would have been more successful if they had kind of drawn us in closer to the one individual they wanted to be the protagonist and maybe given us more backstory of them, some flashbacks into what had happened leading up to their situation that they are currently in, to give us more of an emotional connection to them. But unlike a show like Dune Prophecy, which really kind of slows because of its attempt to cover too much at once, American Primeval is a little bit more successful because the pacing is very fast. And it really does tie up all of these threads by the time it reaches the end of the story. That being said, from a storytelling perspective and from a viewer's perspective, I just believe that Godless is the much better of the 2 series. Godless really draws you in, it really gives you an immediate connection to the characters, multiple characters across the board, and has you invested from the start in what will actually happen to them. But American Primeval does offer a very brutal and realistic view of this particular time period in American history. It's bloody, it's unrelenting, and it's a time period in history that we don't talk about a lot. If you are a fan of reading Western novels and Westerns as literature, you may have read more about this time period, but when it comes to film and TV, we don't really see a lot about this early 10 years before the Civil War-ish time period and what is going on in the far West. And from that perspective, it's very interesting and definitely worth the watch. But I wouldn't necessarily say that American Primeval is for the introductory Western viewer. But in general, the overall reviews have been very good. So I am curious to see if this will usher in a new wave of Westerns, both in TV and in film.